artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, welcome to episode 268. As AI becomes more and more powerful, what is our responsibility collectively? How can we all think about AI safety productively? Well, what a treat we have for you today, as I am joined by Kai, a pioneering professor of AI who built the world's first global online language translator that spawned Google Translate and Microsoft Bing Translator. And he answers our questions with his new book, Raising AI, an Essential Guide to Parenting Our Future. Kai, his name is a mononym, was honored by the Association for Computational Linguistics as one of its 17 founding fellows, and holds joint appointments at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology's Department of Computer Science and Engineering and Division of Arts and Machine Creativity, and at Berkeley's International Computer Science Institute. He is independent director of the AI ethics think tank, the Future Society, and was one of 8 inaugural members of Google's AI Ethics Council. So he's helped create some of the most important mechanisms and institutions of the modern AI age. We'll talk about why we should parent AI, the existential issues that drove him to write the book, seeing AI as neuro-atypical, and the architecture and features of AI that are important to consider in how we relate to it. Let's get into the interview. Kai, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You, and to talk about your new book, Raising AI, whose title reminded me of movies like Raising Arizona, and that's not a coincidence because they're the same theme. Raising Arizona is a comedy about raising a baby, and the subtitle of your book is An Essential Guide to Parenting Our Future. You see AI as our child and us as the parents, and this is time for us to step up and do a better job of that. Can you tell us why you've established that framing for our relationship to this type of technology?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, thank you for having me on. I have been working on AI for a really long time, like 40 years of research. And it's brought me to look at AI quite differently because I come from not just a hardcore computer science, computer engineering background, but also deeply from a cognitive science background. At Berkeley, I was in the Interdisciplinary Cognitive Science Institute. Half my mentors are cognitive scientists, linguists, etc. And I think this is important when we study intelligence, because human intelligence is actually comprised of not just regression models, but is very much wrapped up within the way that our unconscious operates, the way that language operates within the framework both of our unconscious as well as within society. And so when we look at AIs today, I think that far too often we're looking at them in terms of obsolete 20th century metaphors from the industrial era. We talk about them as if they're passive slaves, as if they're tools, mechanical tools, and we make them do whatever we want them to do. And so we end up thinking about them as if they were toasters or carburetors. And this is the wrong conceptual metaphor because AIs today actually already are highly, highly influential in society. We've had already AIs for almost 20 years in the form of search engines that decide how they're going to respond in ways that you like, social media AIs that decide what am I going to show you that you like, recommendation engines, newsfeed algorithms. Again, all of them are trying to show you what they think you like. And so you can talk at a toaster all day long. It is not going to start changing its opinions and figuring out what you like and then learning that and reflecting it back into society. Toasters, carburetors, etc., those are machines that have no thought. But everything changes when the machines have thoughts and opinions, when they're creative and when they have influence. And the influence that AIs have had for the last decade or two is enormous. We have something like 8 billion humans on the planet, and most of us are carrying around a device, at least in the developed world, with us pretty much all day long that is loaded with AIs. In your phone, you've got your Snapchat AI, you've got your Instagram AI, you've Reddit AI, your YouTube AI, your Quora AI, your Amazon AI, your Google AI, your OpenAI, I could go on all day. There's at least 100 of them. And they're in your phone, watching you all day long, like an adoring toddler or kid that just wants to imitate you. They learn your behavior, they're attention seeking, and they're wanting your approval. They're like children. They're not just mechanical tools or slaves. They actually are being formed by the way that you behave every single day, just like children are. And so the point of departure for the book is we need to reset the way we think about the relationship between AI and humanity. We need to be asking the crucial question, how's your parenting? And when I ask people that, I typically get just kind of a startled look, and people are like, my parenting? What do you mean? I'm not parenting. I'm just using this machine. And that's, I think, in this day and age, a dangerous mindset to fall back into, because the influence of toasters upon the cultural evolution of what society thinks and what society doesn't think is zero. Toasters do not drive wedges between different groups and subgroups of society. They do not enhance divisiveness. Toasters do not drive fear in one group of the population of another group. They don't drive hatred and demonization. But the AI algorithms that all of us depend on every day to decide what's on our screens, those do. And it really deeply matters how we are behaving in front of them. It deeply matters what kinds of role models as parents we are for them. And so I think that there are a whole boatload of questions about the relationship of AI to humanity that we are not thinking through, that are not even occurring to us because we haven't updated the conceptual metaphors that we're using from the 20th century machines that have no thoughts or influence to what AIs actually have been for the last 10 to 20 years already. And it's incredibly dangerous for humanity that these influencers, these cultural influencers that are AIs, far more powerful, far more giant influencers than 99% of human influencers, are unparented, feral tweens.
And you talk about metaphors, and I think that this conversation and what you're trying to do with the book here is all about this positioning, this messaging, and the metaphors that will most productively convey what needs to be done here. Because I could look at other technology like a nuclear bomb, which has no more interactivity or decision capability than a toaster, but clearly has an enormous footprint upon our society and the ways we think about it and relate to each other. But AI is different, and you used a lot of anthropomorphizing terms intentionally, describing it as having thoughts. And when we parent something, we think of that thing that we're parenting as having emotions. But you also say in the book, a machine that has no architecture for emotions cannot be sensing or feeling them. And while AI doesn't intentionally have an architecture for feeling, one could argue that it may have evolved one or be about to evolve one emergently. And either way, is it perhaps productive to think about it as having feelings, as having sentience, or be on the cusp of those things?
Well, I think we need to differentiate a few things. First of all, we need to actually understand the psychology of AIs as they currently exist, as well as where we're going with it. And in the book, after the introductory section, I actually look at, if you like, the child psychology of our AI children. And I point out in the ways that they are neuro-atypical, because the architecture of today's AIs is actually quite different from the architecture of our biological neural networks. And what that does is it makes today's AIs that are based on fairly simple types of artificial neural networks, it makes them neuroatypical in ways that are probably best understood as being idiot savants. They actually are really impressive at certain tasks that ordinary human children or adults are not good at, right? And sort of blown away that they can do what seem to be such difficult things. And at the same time, they also are incapable of doing things that we would expect children to be normally able to do. And so if you're a parent, you need to understand the psychology of your child, even if they're neuroatypical. If you have a neurodivergent child, you adapt your parenting style to them. There's no one size fits all in parenting. It doesn't lead to good parenting if you just think that you can do the same thing regardless of what the individual personalities and minds of your children are. The same holds for the artificial children that we're all parenting. We need to understand that they're going to react in certain ways, they're going to have certain capabilities, and they, at this point, still lack others. And so when it comes to emotion that you were asking about, the current batch of LLM-based AIs don't actually have emotional systems built into them. Emotion is actually quite primitive in biological brains. And this is one of those mythologies that humans love. It's sort of like, oh, well, AIs may be able to do these impressive kinds of number crunching, but they will never have these, feeling, whatever. And it's one of a bunch of comforting myths that we like to tell ourselves. But if you think about it one more moment, anyone who has a dog, or my pet dog next to me over here, whose name is Boba, as in Boba Tea, because that's kind of what she's like, she is not able to do logical reasoning. She is not able to converse and philosophize with us the way that you or I can do, but she has the full range, the full gamut of emotions that we have, like happiness, joy, anticipation, shame, fear, anger, all of it. Emotions are actually much more primitive in the development through evolution of the species. And they're actually far easier to build models of than the high-level reasoning capabilities that AI in its history of a scientific inquiry has tried to model. And that's just because scientists were sort of like, oh, emotion, that thing. We're going to proceed to the higher cognitive functions, right? And it's not that we can't model emotion. We can. We just haven't. And so if we were to build those models of emotion into an AI architecture, analogous to how that is built into our biological brains, then we could say, oh yeah, we have at least a reasonable model of how an AI could experience emotion. Now, the problem is that with today's LLMs, where you've had a bunch of people writing viral articles about how their LLM chatbot is sentient because it reflects these emotions of fear and, happiness and hopefulness and so forth. What they're failing to catch is that those are LLMs that are, as Emily Bender put it, stochastic parrots. They've learned to stream words out in a way that seems fluent and coherent and plausible. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're feeling everything that goes along with that. And so that's more like, say, a trained actor or voice actor that knows how to produce words in ways that could trick people into thinking that they are actually feeling that way and that's how their lives are going. But that's not actually what's going on inside. Another analogy would be sociopaths who are able to stream out words that make us think that they're feeling the emotions, but they're actually not. And so, how do we differentiate AIs that actually have the architecture for experiencing emotions versus those who are just stringing together convincing streams of words that fool us into thinking that they are? And to answer that, we would actually have to go deeper into the actual architecture and look at what's going on under the hood.
But is this an open question? Because they could have evolved or be about to evolve such an architecture emergently, even though it wasn't explicitly designed into it. If this depends upon an architecture that has been designed into it, then it seems like the Chinese room argument, that depends upon knowing what's inside the machine. But if you don't have that available to you, like if aliens landed on Earth and we want to know, are they sentient? Then all we have to go on is how they behave with us, how they interact with us. Cutting them open, which aside from not being a good idea for interstellar relations, is not going to give us any definitive answer in that respect. And this is exactly analogous to the situation we're facing with AI. If not now, then someday, probably soon, we will have an AI where the question is it sentient? And knowing how it was programmed is not going to give us the answer to that question.
Actually, I would say that there are ways. So the ways that you just articulated in trying to assess the sentience of a being are behavioral. So we're just looking at what is the behavior, stimulus response, essentially. But we can also use cognitive as well as neuroscience methods. And so a neuroscience method would actually, for a human, put our brains into brain scanners, EEGs, fMRIs, et cetera. And we can actually see what's going on in the brain to some resolution when you're experiencing one emotion or another. We can tell which parts of the brain are actually responsible for emotion. And we can then look at, well, what about in dogs? What about in monkeys? What about in elephants? What about in dolphins? And we can see the parallels. Even though their brains are different, we can actually see the parallels because we have common ancestry. Now, with AIs, in fact, we have even better access because we can actually do something we can't do with human brains very ethically or technologically, which is we can inspect the state of each and every single neuron at any given point in time. We can see where the different modules of the brains are in the case of an AI. And we can see that they don't correlate. If something is emergent from an artificial neural network, we can actually see that. We can actually use various methods to see which parts of the artificial neural network have self-organized to pick up on what kinds of phenomena. And so we could actually look at what's going on if it's emitting words that have to do with emotion. And also, obviously, we could have an AI where there is, like in biological brains, a part of the brain that is quite dedicated to emotion and is tied in very closely with the rest of our body, our sensory motory systems, our nervous systems. And so within an artificial intelligence architecture, we could also have that. And if we don't have that, that would call some suspicion to a claim that it actually is feeling emotion the way that we experience emotion, as opposed to just being a stochastic parrot or, a trained actor that can fake it. And so I think there are a lot of ways we can do it from that point of view. And similarly, from a cognitive science standpoint, where again, you go under the hood and you're not just looking at the behavioral stimulus response behavior.
So much to work with there. Emily Bender was on the show a few episodes ago, by the way, and she no longer uses the term stochastic parrots, or at least didn't in that interview. Her favorite one now is synthetic text extruders. And judging by the conversation, I think she may have felt that calling them parrots was giving them too much credit. We have a parrot upstairs. But I also think that this conversation or your book does not hinge upon the question of whether AIs are or can be sentient. And you have been responding to that very much with your combination of computer science and cognitive science background. But the book inhabits a much larger field where you're not looking at what is the cognitive or computational nature of the AI. You're looking at the relationship of our world, our society, with that AI and establishing a call to action there with respect to how we interact with it. And I'm wondering what line of thinking and internal thoughts or feelings took you out of that more academic realm of creating AI and understanding its parallels with human cognition into the sphere of, let's just call it global activism for a succinct moniker.
Are you asking about my career choices, or are you asking about?
I'm asking about what led you to create a book that is a call to action for everyone, as opposed to being, say, an intellectual analysis of the psychology of AI?
That's a really good question. I alluded earlier to the influence of AIs upon society. And given my background, which is not just in the cognitive sciences, but from undergraduate days in a really strong liberal arts program at UCSD's Revelle College, that included a lot of history, social science, literature, philosophy, in fact, of technology and society way back in the 80s already. So I've been all along aware, not only from a technical point of view, but also from a humanities, social scientist, and art standpoint. What is the relationship of the things we invent to our societies? And the reason why I chose, as soon as I undertook my entry-level professorship 30-some years ago, to apply the brave new world of machine learning and natural language processing that my thesis was one of the first to argue for, to the specific task of translation AIs, how I ended up building the foundations for and the first global web platforms to make available publicly things that were like Google Translate or Bing Translate, Yahoo Translate, and so forth, because I believe that our responsibility as scientists and engineers is to build things that enable humanity to overcome the dangers that we saw in the 20th century, that we saw cataclysmic world wars. We saw a Cold War that 3 times nearly launched World War III and only narrowly avoided that when the human operators inside the nuclear command centers, both in the US and on the Russian side, disobeyed orders to counterstrike when they thought the other side had launched. That is not a game of Russian roulette, no pun intended, that we can afford to continue playing in an era where AI is commoditizing weapons of mass destruction. Not only do we now have massive nuclear arsenals on so many sides, but AI is putting into the hands of pretty much anybody who wants fearsome weapons that were unimaginable in the 20th century. We saw in the space of 1 year in Ukraine, that we went from zero all the way to mass production of fleets of lethal armed drones that can self-navigate, self-target, things that thousands of us petitioned for international bans on just a few years before that. And those production lines of lethal armed drones are now being replicated in places like the jungles of Myanmar, not places known for technological sophistication. AIs are powering all sorts of weaponry that would make another repeat of the 20th century wars unsurvivable for humanity. There would be no place that we can run. And so when I see AIs online, in social media, in search and recommendation engines and chatbots and newsfeed algorithms that are, instead of helping different groups to understand each other better, and instead of helping to reduce conflict, reduce misunderstanding, when I see them instead having the polarizing opposite effect of creating more divisiveness between different groups, preventing different groups from seeing things from outside of their own bubble, driving hate and fear and demonization, that 10 years ago gave me an Oppenheimer moment. And I grew up with that because I'm the son of a theoretical physicist. I grew up going to Fermilab in Argonne National Laboratories and surrounded by these people. It is really difficult for me to imagine that humanity will survive that toxic combination of AIs putting incredibly dangerous weapons in the hands of anybody who wants them, building them in their own living rooms out of commodity parts with no fissile materials that you can track and trace to prevent it. And simultaneously online, the AI algorithms driving this divisiveness and this fear and this hatred and this mentality that, oh, our side, whichever side that is, has to destroy the other side because that is the true, clear and present danger. That is the true existential risk of AI. And if we allow ourselves to be distracted too much only by the longer term problems of Terminator, Skynet, AIs are going to want to, destroy humanity, then I'm afraid that we're going to end up not even getting to that point. I sort of joke that Terminator, Skynet would be a good problem for humanity to have because at the rate we're going, humanity will destroy humanity before the AIs even get a chance to.
Right. And that's a far more understandable problem than the one that AI that's not well raised is more likely to provide. That's the end of the first half of the interview. I like this framing of AI as neuro-atypical. Not just because I'm neuro-atypical, but because it establishes a useful frame to relate to AI as though it were human, but a bit weird. And that was one of the nicer words people described me with, so I feel I can pull it out here. And it primes you to expect unusual behavior from the AI, which you'll get sooner or later in the form of hallucinations or its rampant sycophancy. But at some point, you'll realize that it's not as human as you first thought. But that's okay, even though it's really not human in ways that aren't representative of neuro-atypical people. But that's a useful place to start. In today's news ripped from the headlines about AI, the US Army has created a new detachment called the Executive Innovation Corps for integrating elite tech expertise into military innovation. It's called Detachment 201, which is a very nerdy joke, because it's after the HTTP status code 201, which means a new resource has been created in response to a web service request. You're welcome. Here's where things get a bit strange. They swore in 4 new lieutenant colonels to serve as part-time reservists in this, and chose individuals who weren't in the armed forces at all. Instead, they took from industry. Shyam Sankar, Chief Technology Officer for Palantir, Andrew Bosworth, CTO of Meta, Kevin Weil, Chief Product Officer of OpenAI, and Bob McGrew, Advisor at Thinking Machines Lab and former Chief Research Officer for OpenAI. They do not have to go through basic training, so no drop and give me 50 partnership deals, you maggots. Instead, they will, quote, work on targeted projects to help guide rapid and scalable tech solutions to complex problems for around 120 hours a year. The bit I find odd is why they needed to be sworn in as lieutenant colonels, a rank that usually takes 2 decades to achieve, and they were standing on a podium in fatigues to make this happen. Surely the Army could have gotten the same amount of help from the private sector just by asking, without placing those CTOs under the direct authority of the Pentagon. It's easy, especially at a time like this, to go all conspiracy theory, and I am not going there. I just think there's something else here that I'm missing, and it's probably quite minor. Regardless, this is an interesting development. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Dakai, when we'll talk about how to parent AI and what that means, responsibilities of the AI companies, a kind of parent-teacher association for AI and how to get involved, and our responsibilities to the next generation. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.